My worry with a lot of companies is, oh, this feels good. It's like a nice to have thing. Let's go do this. It's good for the planet. And then they stack rank it amongst all the other initiatives, and it's just a can that just keeps getting kicked down the road. My worry for a lot of businesses, unless there's some type of external force like government policy, that it always kind of takes a backseat. I remember when I was younger, people talked about global warming, but I just felt like we didn't have enough data, right? I remember it wasn't, you couldn't see it out the window as much, right? And now I think it's in our face. You can't hide from it. You can look outside and see the smoke and the byproduct of all this. And so I think people are definitely, there seems to be a heightened sense around it now than there used to be. But part of the challenge also is just years and years and years of infrastructure that have been built. And we didn't know at the time the byproduct of this. But now I think some of the challenges I've observed with businesses, there seems to be a lot of a hope towards a target without real metrics and milestones to measure. And I think that's where your company comes in, and probably parts of your observation was it's a hard thing. So how do you attack this for companies?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a really, really hard thing. This maybe resonates more with the accountants that we talk to than with the broader audience, but it's basically if you wanted to reinvent accounting from the ground up without generally accepted accounting principles. So imagine that there's no gap and you have to come up with accounting by yourself, and you're accounting things when you're not all that familiar with money. That's kind of what carbon accounting looks like for most businesses right now. And so you really do have to kind of start at the beginning. And to your point, get a clear sense of your baseline before you can really set meaningful reduction targets. And make sure that when you're measuring that baseline, you're doing it in a repeatable way so that you can actually get new metrics, ideally every month, but maybe every quarter or every year, so that you're able to kind of make real operational decisions on the data that you have. And so we think about that in a couple of pieces. And the first, it sounds simple, but it's harder than you might think, which is just drawing organizational boundaries. So we're going to start measuring your company's carbon emissions. How do we define your company? How are we going to start by thinking about all of your suppliers? Are we going to think about, the end of life of your product? Does somebody recycle it? Are they throwing it away? If it's a digital product, are they using it on their phone? Are they using it on their laptop? Are there ways that we can make that less, energy intensive? And so you really kind of have to think about what you're planning to measure and why. And I think so many things about sustainability can and should be iterative. And I think a lot of people get kind of paralyzed in the beginning because they say, you know what, I can't measure every single thing that my suppliers are doing. And I can't measure every single way that my end customer uses my product. And what we try to tell people is that that's really okay. You just want to be clear with what you're doing.
It's like trying to clean your garage, right? You walk out there and you go, oh, forget it, right? Yeah.
Totally. No, you just want to start anywhere and be clear about what that definition is. So you want to start by drawing those organizational boundaries. And maybe that boundary is look, we're just going to do scope 1 and 2. I'm going to take all of the electricity we're using. I'm going to take all the diesel that we're burning, and I'm going to measure that. And then you can set goals for yourself over time to say, you know what, I want to expand my organizational boundary as I can get more and more data, or I have, more and more stakeholders who are bought into this. Then you can start really expanding that and going further. But that's a really important place to start, especially so that as a smaller business, you don't get totally overwhelmed with the magnitude of this problem, because that doesn't help anybody, right? It doesn't serve your business. It doesn't serve the broader goals.
Is that a big part of when you enter with a company? Just kind of, there's a big consulting aspect to this. It's not just a product. Right? You got to really get in and define, kind of create basically a roadmap or how you want to get after this problem.
That is a huge part of the challenge, and I think a place where we really differentiate. So we're a SaaS platform, and so we do what we do without a services layer or without consultants. And so we've really focused on a product-led experience where you can build that kind of process into the product itself, which I think is critical for the mid-market, because these are folks who either can't afford a services-led experience or frankly don't have the time to spend 6 weeks ramping up with a consultant and managing them and working through it. So we've really tried to build as much as we can into the actual product to guide people through how to do that on their own.
What do you find? I can imagine some of the challenges running companies, of course, is everyone wants to see growth, right? Top revenue growth and managing the bottom line, and those always seem to be the things that are constantly the priority. And then you've got sustainability, and we could talk maybe in a little bit more about the macro levels and policy and how that plays a role. But I'd be curious on how do you see this getting kind of prioritized? Because my worry with a lot of companies is, oh, this feels good. it's like a nice to have thing. Let's go do this. It's good for the planet. And then they stack rank it amongst all the other initiatives, and it's just a can that just keeps getting kicked down the road. So my worry for a lot of businesses, unless there's some type of external force like government policy, that it always kind of takes a backseat.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's one that we talk about internally a lot as kind of like our why now. Like, why do we think that this is an important problem right now? And why do we think it's going to change so dramatically in the next 10 years? And so there's a few pieces, right? One is that regulatory piece, which is clearly coming in the U.S., already in place in in Europe and other places abroad. Um, but the other big things we see are, especially for our client base, which tends to be, more in the mid-market and folks who want to own this process themselves, a lot of them are driven by their large corporate clients. So folks like, Walmart, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, who are setting targets and saying, hey, if you want to supply us, you're going to have to meet these targets too. And in some cases, those folks are preparing for forthcoming regulation and they want to sort of be prepared themselves. But in other cases, it's part of their mission, it's part of their brand promise. And I think a lot of that is driven by customer expectations and customers consistently saying, like, hey, I want you to deliver something that's more sustainable to me. And I think, to your point at the beginning of this conversation, so much of that is driven by the physical climate change that we see around us. And so when you see, flooding and heat and fire, those are things that customers deal with every day. And so they want to see the companies that they purchase from kind of addressing those issues. But you also see it really driving this like broader recalculation of risk across the economy, right? So it's insurers saying, hey, I don't want to insure something that is at risk for all of these new kinds of physical changes. And you also see it with companies who are looking at not just here are my requirements for my supply chain because they fit the sustainability thesis I have, but they're really saying like, hey, I want to reduce supply chain risk. Like I'm worried that if you're really exposed to flood as my supplier, you're not going to be there in 5 years. And so I'm not going to be able to get all the stuff that I need. And so I think, as we talk about why are the next 10 years going to be so critical? Why is this space going to change so much in the next 10 years? It's really the reality of all that physical change that's manifesting in, all these different groups, whether it's consumers or insurers or large corporates, that's really going to drive the requirements, whether it's corporate or insurance or et cetera requirements, or actually regulatory requirements.
Yeah.